Over the past 75 years, more than 10,000 chemicals have entered our food supply, but the EU allows just 300 additives. At Thrive Market, we prioritize quality, banning over 1,000 ingredients found in conventional grocery stores. Our Healthy Swap scanner helps you find better versions of your pantry essentials without the junk, dyes, or fillers, and everything is delivered right to your doorstep. So shop at a grocery store that actually cares about your health at thrivemarket.com/get-started for 30% off your first order and a free $60 gift.
Hi everyone, I'm Cindy, the host of True Crime California, a weekly podcast about murders and other true crime that takes place in the Great Golden State. Join me every week as I talk about a new case, some very well known and others not so well known, but always coming straight out of California. True Crime California is a proud member of the Darkcast Network.
Darkcast Network, indie pods with a dark side.
It's officially 2025, and we are kicking it off with a bang. Remember that wild interrogation video of Ryan Waller we replayed for y'all last week? If you haven't heard it, pause this episode right now and go listen to that first. If you have heard it, you'll vividly remember him being questioned by police while literally sitting there with a bullet lodged in his brain. Well, buckle up, because today we're diving even deeper into Ryan's story. And trust us, it's so much more than just that video.
This episode is about what led up to that infamous interrogation and what came after. From a horrifying home invasion to the jaw-dropping decisions made by law enforcement, Ryan's story will leave you stunned and, honestly, probably a little furious, and more furious than you already were after you watched the interrogation video. But it's not just Ryan's story we're telling today. His dad, Don, has been fighting for years to get his son's story out there, and he comes with many, many receipts.
Christmas is usually about family, presents, and good food, right? But for Ryan and his family, Christmas 2006 turned into a nightmare, one they're still living with today. This isn't just a true crime. It's a story of resilience, heartbreak, and an ongoing fight for justice. There's a lot of vital information to share in the next 2 episodes. We'll be walking you through the timeline from Don's perspective, and trust us, there are critical moments later in his story that you won't want to miss. I'm Amber.
And I'm Gina.
And this is part 1 of the real story of what happened to Ryan Waller and Heather Quan.
Let's rewind the clock to Ryan's early days. Born on February 12, 1988 in Phoenix, Arizona, Ryan was the first child of Don and Julie Waller, and he wasn't about to let them ease into parenthood. Don described Ryan as a happy baby who was always on the move, and he meant always. The kid was walking by 9 months, and no crib, playpen, or barrier could contain him. Basically, Don and Julie got a crash course in toddler chasing 101. Ryan's childhood was packed with energy and curiosity. By the age of 3, he was already carving up the slopes as a snow skier, often leaving his dad in the dust. The following year, he joined Little League Baseball with Don as his coach. Sports were a huge part of Ryan's life, but his interest didn't stop there. Every summer, the Wallers would head to Michigan to visit family. Ryan loved fishing on the lake, exploring the woods, and soaking up all the nature vibes. So much so that he'd talk endlessly about Michigan and how he wanted to live there someday. His dad joked that Ryan could have worked for the Michigan Chamber of Commerce.
At 10, Ryan discovered a new love, music. Thanks to his uncle and cousins, he got into the guitar, and it didn't take long for his natural talent to shine. Within a couple of years, Ryan could hear a song once and play it perfectly in just minutes. He wasn't into the trendy music of the time either. Nope. Ryan was all about classic rock from the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Don was thrilled and even handed over his prized CD collection to his son. Ryan's teen years were pretty typical. He worked a few part-time jobs, including at a local Mexican restaurant where the family liked to sing karaoke. And he saved up to buy his first car, a 2001 Ford Mustang, which he babied by washing it daily. Ryan and his friends loved cruising around town or jamming out together, playing whatever music moved them that day.
When Ryan turned 18, he started working for Don's pest control company, getting hands-on experience and spending even more time with his dad. But it didn't stop there. Don also took on home construction and remodeling projects, and Ryan became his right-hand man. Don described Ryan as a skilled carpenter who wasn't afraid to roll up his sleeves, but breaking into the music industry was his ultimate goal. So while Ryan was busy playing his guitar and building a life around his love of music, there was another major part of his story: Heather Quan. Their connection went way back to childhood. Ryan was about 8 when he and Heather first met, running around their neighborhood playground playing tag and hide and seek. She was 10, a couple of years older, but that didn't stop them from becoming fast friends.
As the years went on, their paths stayed close. Ryan and Heather grew up in the same area, so they were always in each other's orbit. But it wasn't until they were older that their childhood friendship turned into something more. After dating for about a year, the two decided to move in together, ready to start building a future. Heather was the kind of person who left a lasting impression. She had this incredible ability to sense when someone was hurting, and she didn't just offer sympathy, she showed up. Heather volunteered as a big sister with the Valley Big Brother Big Sister program, offering guidance and support to kids who needed it most. And that wasn't the only way she made an impact.
After earning her associate degree at Glendale Community College, Heather dove headfirst into studying criminal law at Arizona State University, with dreams of becoming a criminal defense attorney. Her goal was to help people who usually got the short end of the stick in the justice system. She was determined, compassionate, and full of life, the kind of person who made the world a little brighter just by being in it. Tragically, Ryan and Heather's story didn't get the ending it deserved, but the bond they shared and the lives they touched remained unforgettable parts of their legacy. It was so nice getting to learn more about who Ryan was and his childhood, and Don just lights up talking about Ryan, and he was such a cool kid, and he just he had that old school vibe about him. We're similar age to Ryan and Heather, and so it's pretty cool that he wasn't into all the kind of emo rock stuff of the time and liked the classics, and Don was so happy that that's what he likes instead of
sure.
the newer stuff. He seemed like an all-around good kid, who played music and had his jobs, and he was responsible and
had his whole life ahead of him.
And I didn't know that he and Heather grew up together. So I thought it was so sweet that they were just, these little friends that met on the playground in the neighborhood and grew up knowing each other, and then it just eventually naturally turned into something else. And Don said that he never thought anything more would come of it, and so it was pretty cool when it did. So they both seem like really cool kids. Yeah.
Now that you've got a feel for who Ryan and Heather were, let's get into the days leading up to that tragic Christmas day in 2006. At the time, Ryan was helping his dad, Don, with a big construction project they'd been working on together for about 3 weeks. December 23rd was just another day on the job, with the two of them putting in hours side by side. When they wrapped up for the day, Ryan told Don he'd see him at Christmas dinner. They exchanged I love yous, said goodbye, and went their separate ways. December 24th was pretty quiet. Don didn't talk to Ryan that day, but that wasn't unusual. He figured Ryan was busy or catching up on some much-needed sleep. Fast forward to Christmas Day, and things started to feel a little off.
Welcome to Murder Mimosas.
I'm Shannon.
And I'm Danica.
Are you looking for a unique twist on your true crime podcast? Join us on Murder and Mimosas, where a dynamic mom and daughter duo delve into chilling crime stories while sipping mimosas.
Each Saturday, we mix our favorite brunch drink and dive into some of the most intriguing true crime cases. Our casual yet captivating conversations blend our southern sarcasm with fresh perspective.
So pour yourself a mimosas, get cozy, and tune in as we uncover the darker side of humanity together.
Don tried calling Ryan earlier in the day, but his calls went straight to voicemail. He wasn't overly concerned. After all, Ryan was an adult and probably just sleeping in or caught up with something. But by dinner time, when there was still no word from Ryan, Don's concern started to grow. He even tried calling again during dinner, but still nothing. By the time dinner wrapped up, it was after 7 p.m., and Don couldn't shake the gut feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't like Ryan to completely ghost on Christmas, especially since it was his first holiday not living at home. Parents know their kids, and Don just knew that something was off.
Parents really do know when something is off with their kids.
Mm-hmm.
Like, even my mom being 500 miles away, like, if there's something really bad going on, she'll, like, just randomly text me, hey, you okay?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They know.
It's just a vibe. I mean, obviously, our kids are young and they're still in the same house, but or they get home from school and they just seem off.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, something is not quite right. And to mention that this was the first time that Ryan did not live at home at Christmas. He had only been living outside of the house for about 2 months at this point.
Yep.
And, they were probably so excited to have him home for Christmas dinner. His first Christmas holiday as an adult.
Yeah.
Quote unquote.
On his own, and being able to go back home.
He wouldn't have missed it.
No. He and Julie decided to drive over to Ryan's house to check on him. When they got there, they knocked on the door, but no one answered. The garage was closed, so they couldn't tell if Ryan's car was there, but the silence coming from the house wasn't comforting. At this point, Don and Julie were worried enough to call the police and request a welfare check. The dispatcher assured them that an officer would call them back, but that call didn't come for almost 4 hours. It's Christmas night, and Don and Julie are in a terrible limbo, waiting for hours to hear back from the police about their welfare check request. Finally, sometime between 11:30 p.m. and midnight, they got a call from an officer who said they'd check on Ryan. About 30 minutes later, the officers arrived at Ryan's house.
Yeah, and they got there just before 8 o'clock p.m. And so now it's midnight, and they're finally getting a call back saying, we'll come check it out. And then it took another 30 minutes for them to actually get there. And then when they did get there, they started by knocking on the doors and windows, but there was no response. According to Don, they used a flashlight to look through the vertical blinds on a front window, and that's when they spotted what looked like a body lying on the couch. At that point, they told Don and Julie to move away from the house while they called for a search warrant to enter. Yeah. Amber just threw her head back. Yeah, we talked about this in the first one, but the fact that you see a person laying unconscious on a couch and you have to call and wait for a search warrant to enter is just...
It's so stupid.
It's very stupid.
Like, if they've been banging on the doors and the windows, making noise, announcing their presence, calling out, and whoever they see laying on the couch isn't moving, they probably need help. Okay. Mm-hmm. It's just going to get worse from here. So
it does. And not to mention that they call for that search warrant, but it took another hour for them to get it. So they call for the search warrant. Another hour goes by, finally gets approved. And at that point, Dawn said the scene became overwhelming as around 10 police cars arrived and a helicopter with a spotlight was circling overhead. This is pretty serious, intense situation. Officers finally gained entry to the house, and shortly after, they came back out with Ryan in handcuffs.
Here's where things start to get really bizarre. Despite the low light, Dawn noticed immediately that Ryan's face was visibly injured. He had severe bruising around his eye. But instead of getting medical attention, Ryan was put in the back of a police car. Naturally, Dawn tried to approach him to make sure he was okay, but he was met with aggressive resistance. Here's Dawn talking about that moment.
I tried to walk towards the police car. What's going on? You come after me. I'm taking you back for the last now almost hour trying. And as I'm going toward this police car, this officer comes up and says, "Don't you dare go near that car." And I said, "Sir, I just want to see if my son's okay." And he yells at me and says, "Your son's fine. He just has a black eye." And I tried to take another step. He gets in front of me and he chest bumps me. And he says, "Take another step. Take another step." And he's taunting me. And I had no idea that he's a murder suspect, but I want to see what's wrong with my son.
It's just the fact.
Oh my God. Like, and the picture of Ryan's face. If Dawn could see how bad that was in such low light. Yes, the police have probably spotlights and their lights and everything, but it's still not like broad daylight. If he can still see how bad.
Yeah, in the middle of the night.
Ryan's face is injured. And they're not getting medical treatment.
And just the way they treated him is horrible. Like, he's like, "I'm his dad. I just want to see if he's okay." Yeah. The fact that they wouldn't even let him near him.
Yep.
It's just ridiculous.
The chest bumping and the taunting, take another step. Like,
there's no need for that.
He's a concerned parent about his child.
And the officers didn't even take the time to be like, "Who are you to him? Are you a relative?" They didn't ask him any questions. They didn't verify that he was a family member, nothing. They never even took the time to talk to Dawn and Julie at the scene. Or fill them in on what had happened, or make that connection. Nothing. None of it. Yeah.
Well, we will have the picture of Ryan that we are talking about on our website to see for yourself just how severe the bruising and everything was.
And close-ups, too. It's different pictures than the ones that we posted before.
Yep. So at this point, Dawn and Julie were completely in the dark. They had no idea what happened inside the house or that Ryan was a suspect. Meanwhile, the scene at the house continued to unfold. Emergency vehicles came and went. But according to Dawn, no one checked on Ryan's condition despite his obvious injuries, and he remained sitting in the back of the police car.
And then there's the unexpected twist. Ryan and Heather's roommate, Alicia, was home during all of this. Alicia wasn't there when Dawn and Julie first arrived, but during the 15 minutes that they left to go grab coffee right down the street, she came back to the house. Alicia later said that the house was dark and nothing seemed alarming at first. She actually did briefly speak to Ryan and asked him what had happened to his face, noticing the bruising but not realizing how serious his injuries were. Ryan told her, "There was a problem and I took care of it." Thinking nothing of it, she went to her room and closed the door. She didn't see anybody else in the house. It was very dark. She couldn't tell there was anything going on around her. She walked in, had that brief conversation with Ryan, went to her room and shut the door. And when the police knocked for the welfare check later, Alicia heard them, but assumed that Ryan had answered the door when the knocking stopped. And by the time the police gained entry, the situation had spiraled and Alicia came out to see what was happening.
At 4 a.m., Ryan was still sitting in the back of the police car, his injuries untreated, while Dawn and Julie were left to piece things together. Even then, no one explained what was going on. Eventually, an officer told them to go home, saying it would be another 5 to 10 hours before anyone would talk to them. By the morning of December 26th, Dawn was finally starting to get answers, but nothing could have prepared him for what he learned. At 7:04 a.m., Dawn got a call from St. Joseph's Hospital. The hospital staff told them Ryan was in critical condition. A bullet was lodged in his brain and his left jaw was broken. Although doctors weren't sure how the jaw injury happened because it wasn't related to the gunshot.
When Dawn rushed to the hospital, he was allowed to see Ryan, but he still didn't know the full story. While Dawn was in Ryan's room, an officer came in to ask about the girl, Heather, who was found dead inside the house. That's how Dawn learned Heather died. No one told him before that moment. Just sitting there, seeing your son in this situation, and then finding out that his girlfriend is dead. That's it. Nonchalant. It's ridiculous. And Ryan's injuries were catastrophic. The bullet had traveled through his nasal passages, taking tissue with it, and lodged in his brain, causing a severe infection. Doctors said the infection had to subside before they could perform the life-saving brain surgery he desperately needed. Ryan was forced to wait 2 agonizing days for the surgery.
Dawn was terrified for his son. Not just because of his injuries, but also because Ryan was the only witness to what had happened that night. Dawn was convinced whoever did this might come back to finish the job. To protect Ryan, the hospital staff hid him in the pediatrics wing and gave him a code name, Guitar. Only people who knew the code name could get updates about him. Dawn described how he sat by Ryan's side every day from 7 a.m. to 10 p.m., waiting for any sign of hope. Then finally, over 2 weeks after the surgery, there it was.
And finally, the first glimmer of hope I had was maybe a week or so later. He had been laying in the hospital bed, and they put cups on your legs that pump up air to massage your legs so you don't get blood clots from laying there so long. And they had those on his legs all the time. And there was one day I'm in the hospital room, and I see him take with his foot. It must have been bothering him. When he took his foot, and he took his big toe and he hooked it over, like if you try to pull your sock down with it, you hooked it over the pad or the edge of the cup to try to pull that down. And that was one of the happiest moments of my life, to say that, hey, his brain is able to say, hey, this is bothering me. I'm going to use my toe to, and so that's when I finally realized that maybe he does have some, brain function that he's able to do something.
It's interesting to me because when you think about these moments, you think about them like opening their eyes or trying to say something or, something more standard like that. But to sit there and watch your son and then suddenly you see him trying to do something as nonchalant or like human is just trying to get something off
because it's bothering him.
It's like, wow, like his brain is telling him that something is bothering him. Like, oh, thank God. Like,
I think that's a more comforting sign to see than somebody just kind of opening their eyes or looking at you.
Absolutely. Because
that shows you can kind of do that like in your subconscious, like, oh, this is bothering me, but it's more like there's more to it. There's your brain like giving you these signals and then your brain telling you to do this. And so that was a very good sign that there was still good brain function.
Absolutely.
Some, at least.
Absolutely. Ryan's road to recovery was brutal. He endured 5 surgeries and lost most of the left side of his frontal lobe. This had a significant impact on his personality and quality of life. According to clevelandclinic.org, the frontal lobe handles the ability to reason, executive functions like self-control, attention span, and memory, as well as social understanding, which is basically what tells us what we should or shouldn't do or say. We'll discuss this in more detail in part 2, but Ryan was impacted by all of these things and more, thanks to the severity of his injury. He also lost sight in his left eye, and it eventually had to be removed. In rehab, Ryan had to relearn how to walk and talk, and through all of this, he was asking about Heather, not realizing she had died in the home invasion. Dawn eventually had to break the devastating news to him. And what makes this all worse, yes, it gets worse, is how the police handled things. According to Dawn, during the 40 or so days that Ryan spent in the hospital, not a single officer visited to check on him, ask questions, or try to figure out who is behind the attack. When an event like this happens, wouldn't the first thing law enforcement does to be to question the families of the people involved? Yeah. And during our conversation, Dawn mentioned that how in the history of murder investigations, when have detectives never gone to the immediate family members asking for information? You know,
it's
and
the first thing that you see.
The first thing. He's like, talk about, you know, what we see in true crime shows and documentaries. It usually reflects what law enforcement should do, which is go talk to the families first. But as we've learned doing this for quite some time now, that's not necessarily the case in real life, ever.
Nope. Despite the intensive physical and mental recovery Ryan endured after the shooting, one thing never changed. Ryan knew who was responsible for the death of his girlfriend and his severe injuries. Dawn shared that from the moment Ryan woke up, he consistently said the same thing. Richie and Larry Carver were the ones who shot him and Heather. And Dawn wasn't even the first person Ryan told this to. But we'll dive into that part of this twisted tale later on.
That's the worst part of this whole thing, is that if he had just been listened to, and we'll get into this more later because we're telling this from Dawn's point of view and the way that he learned everything that happened. But if they had just listened, and if somebody had come to talk to him at the hospital and Ryan would have said the same thing from the hospital, something could have been done much faster. But, you know.
Now let's talk about the investigation, or maybe we should say lack of investigation, because what went down here is just beyond frustrating.
Yeah. So right after the crime, police spent over a day and a half tearing through Ryan's house, searching for evidence. At this point, law enforcement is still certain that Ryan is their suspect. They just need to find the weapon. Dawn shared that they shredded the furniture, leaving stuffing all over the house. In a now deleted recording, Dawn alleges that the investigating officer confessed to tearing through the insulation in the attic in an attempt to find a gun. But they came up empty-handed. The only gun in the home was an old one that had belonged to Ryan's grandfather, and he kept it packed away.
Fast forward to over 40 days after the shooting, when Ryan was finally back home from the hospital. The police finally showed up to interview him. Yeah, over a month after the crime. Ryan didn't hesitate. He told them exactly what he had been saying since day one. Richie and Larry Carver were responsible. Based on Ryan's statement, detectives finally secured a search warrant and began moving forward with the case. Richie Carver was arrested at his parents' house in early February 2007, just days after Ryan named him during the interview at the house. Meanwhile, Larry Carver had already fled to California right after the shooting and stayed there while the police executed the initial search warrant and arrested Richie. After Richie's arrest, Cheryl Carver, Richie's mom and Larry's wife, came forward to the police with information about Larry's involvement.
According to the police records, Cheryl stated that on the night of the crime, Larry and Richie went to Ryan's house to retrieve some of Richie's belongings. When Larry returned home, he told Cheryl, "I've got to get the fuck out of here," admitting he had killed 2 people. Cheryl claimed that Larry said he'd shot Ryan in the back of the head and Heather twice in the head to eliminate any witnesses. She also said Larry forced her to dispose of bullets that matched the murder weapon before fleeing to California that same night. When asked if she would testify in court, Cheryl responded, "If I make it." According to the report, she was terrified of Larry and feared he would kill her and then himself. This fear would play a significant role in what happened later. Not long after Cheryl gave her statement, Larry returned from California and was arrested.
This was far from Larry and Richie's first run-ins with the law. They both had extensive rap sheets. Let's start with Richie. At just 17 years old, Richie was arrested for stabbing a person while attempting to steal their car and served 4 years in prison for aggravated assault. And that was just the beginning. His record also included domestic violence, armed robbery, disorderly conduct, and weapons misconduct. Real upstanding guy, am I right? Larry wasn't any better. His criminal record spanned decades and included charges for aggravated assault, domestic violence, burglary, and more weapons-related offenses. There were even instances where Richie and Larry had been arrested for physically fighting each other. A true father-son bonding experience, apparently. Just two peas in a fucked up pod.
When I tell you the list, pages and pages of arrest records for these men is like in the 200s.
So it's like you have people in the community that are well known. They're going to be well known. If they've been arrested and in trouble that many times, they are going to be well known throughout the police department. And in my general experience, after doing this for so long, when there's a crime like this, people typically look for who's in the area that has this sort of MO.
Yeah. Not to mention, the victim named them.
I was leaving that off, but because they weren't listening to Ryan from the beginning. So if they're not going to listen to Ryan, why not utilize the rest of their police training or common fucking sense to think about who else is in the area?
That would make sense, if they wanted to try to pin it on anybody else, but
they were tunnel visioned.
Exactly. Around the time of the Carvers' arrests and Cheryl's police statement, a significant change was made to a key detail in the case. Initially, Heather's autopsy report stated that she was killed sometime between 5 p.m. and 8 p.m. on Christmas Day. But about a month and a half later, the report was revised, now claiming that she had died on December 23rd, 2 days earlier. According to Dawn, the reason given for this change was that Heather's rigor mortis was breakable, indicating that she had been dead for a longer period than initially believed. This convenient revision didn't just shift Heather's time of death, it also made it seem like Ryan had been shot on the 23rd rather than the 25th. If true, this timeline gave police an out for their delay in getting him medical care. After all, if Ryan had been injured 2 days earlier, those extra hours in the police car wouldn't have made much of a difference to his injuries, or so they could argue.
Dawn wasn't convinced, and neither were Heather's parents. Heather's gravestone still lists her date of death as December 25th, 2006. If they believe the coroner's decision to change the report, don't you think they would have changed the gravestone to reflect this? Oh, and there's one more glaringly obvious problem with this date change. In a recorded interview, Heather's best friend, Christina, stated that she saw Heather on Christmas Eve. Here's the clip.
I went to her father's house, picked her up, and we went to Arrowhead Mall. We walked around for a little bit. And do you know that we did eat cookies that day at Miss Phillips' Cookies? And then I took her back to her father's house. We went inside. I believe we both took a small nap because I woke up and she was sleeping.
Yeah.
It's hard to make out a couple parts in her statement, but what can't be misconstrued is that Heather spent time with her friend Christina on Christmas Eve. How could she have done this if she was killed the day before? To Dawn, this timeline adjustment felt more like an effort to protect the police than a genuine reflection of the facts. And as we'll get into in part 2, this isn't the only time the date of the crime has changed. It's just the first time the Wallers and Quans have heard about it.
In part 2, we'll dive into the joint trial of Richie and Larry Carver, including the bombshell moment when Ryan's interrogation video was played for the jury. We'll uncover the shocking inconsistencies in the case, how Heather's Law came to be, and the Waller family's relentless fight for justice. Plus, Dawn shares exclusive insights about Ryan's life and the lasting impact of the tragedy. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast and follow us on social media so you don't miss the second half of Ryan and Heather's story. Trust us, you're going to want to hear how this all unfolds.
Until part 2, stay safe.
And make good choices.
Bye.
Bye.